I want to tell you about the night my life split in two. But to understand that night, you need to understand the road first. The road is where I lived, not my house. I barely spent enough time there to call it living. The road, the cab of a Freightliner Cascadia with 487,000 miles on the odometer, a passenger seat buried under receipts and energy drink cans, and an AM/FM radio that only picked up country stations and late-night preachers past midnight. That was my real home. I spent more hours in that cab than I ever spent in my own bed, and for a long time, I told myself that was fine. That was the deal. I drive, I earn, my family lives well. It's a simple equation. Except life isn't math, and the things you don't count end up costing you the most. My name is Jason Cole. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 5 years, I've driven long haul for a freight company out of the Midwest. My usual route takes me from our depot near home to distribution centers across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and sometimes as far as the coast. A typical run is 5 to 7 days out, then 3 or 4 days back home before the next one. It's not glamorous work. You sit for 12 hours, you eat gas station food, you sleep in a bunk the size of a coffin, and you do it again the next day. But the money is good, better than anything else I could get without a college degree. And when I started, that's all that mattered. My wife Laura and I had just had our second kid, the mortgage was new, and we needed steady income more than we needed each other's company. At least, that's what we told ourselves. Laura is 31. We got married when she was 22 and I was 25, about 6 months after she dropped out of community college, and I got tired of pretending I was going to go. We'd been dating since high school. She was a pretty girl from the year below me. I was a quiet kid who worked on cars in his dad's garage. It wasn't a dramatic love story. We just fit together the way people do in small towns where the options are limited and comfort is easy to mistake for destiny. Our daughter Maisie is 5 now and starting kindergarten in the fall. Our son Owen just turned 3. They are, without question, the best things I've ever been part of making. Everything I did on the road, every mile, every overnight, every missed birthday and bedtime story, I did for them. I need you to believe that, because later in this story, you might wonder. The night I'm going to start with was a Thursday in early March. I was somewhere on I-70 in eastern Ohio, maybe 40 miles from the state line, hauling a load of automotive parts to a warehouse outside Pittsburgh. The highway was empty the way only Midwestern highways are at 2 in the morning. No cars, no lights, just the broken white line disappearing under my bumper in a rhythm that could put you to sleep if you weren't careful. I had the radio on low, some country song about a man losing his woman, which is what 90% of country songs are about, and which I'd never found particularly relevant to my life. I called Laura around 10 that night, before she went to bed. It was the same conversation we had every night I was on the road. How are the kids? Fine. Maisie lost another tooth. Owen wouldn't eat his peas. How was work? Same. Register 4 jammed again. I miss you. Miss you too. Drive safe. Then she'd hang up, and I'd drive for another 4 hours in silence. I didn't know it then. Sitting in that dark cab with the hum of 18 wheels beneath me and the smell of old coffee in the cup holder. But that version of my life had about 3 weeks left. 3 weeks before I'd come home a day early and see a truck I didn't recognize in my driveway. 3 weeks before I'd stand in my own hallway, listening to a man's voice coming from behind my bedroom door. 3 weeks before my 3-year-old son would look up at me over breakfast and casually mention a name that would rearrange everything I thought I knew about my family. But on that Thursday night, rolling through Ohio in the dark, I didn't know any of that. I was just a man on a road, doing his job, counting the miles until home. And home, as far as I knew, was exactly where I'd left it. The thing about being a long-haul driver is that you develop a strange relationship with absence. You get used to not being there. You miss the first steps, the first words, the school plays, the Saturday morning cartoons. You call home and hear about these things secondhand, like a relative who lives overseas. And after a while, you stop feeling the sting of it. The absence becomes normal, and normal is dangerous. Because normal means you stop paying attention. I stopped paying attention. Not to the road. I was always sharp behind the wheel, never had an accident in 5 years, not even a fender scrape. I stopped paying attention to the things that mattered more than the road. To the tiredness in Laura's voice that I mistook for sleepiness. To the way she stopped saying, "I love you," at the end of our calls and replaced it with, "drive safe," which I told myself was the same thing, but wasn't. To the fact that my daughter had started talking about someone named Kevin, and I never once asked who he was. I got back from that Pittsburgh run on a Sunday afternoon. Pulled into the driveway around 3, stiff-legged and bleary from 6 days on the road. The house looked the same as always. White siding, black shutters, the lawn a little shaggy because I hadn't mowed it before I left, and Laura didn't own a pair of shoes she'd ruin on wet grass. Maisie saw the truck through the front window and came flying out the door before I even had my bag out of the cab. She hit me at full speed, arms around my waist, face buried in my jacket. Owen followed behind her at a toddler's careful trot, arms up, waiting to be picked up. I hoisted him onto my hip and carried my bag inside with my free hand. Laura was in the kitchen doorway, drying her hands on a towel. She smiled, the same tired, genuine smile she always gave me when I walked in. "Welcome home, stranger," she said, and kissed me on the cheek. For 3 days, this was my life. And it felt good. That first evening, I did what I always did when I got home. Showered, ate whatever Laura had made, and sat on the couch with the kids until bedtime. Maisie wanted to show me a drawing she'd done at school, a crayon picture of our house with 4 stick figures standing in front of it. Me, Laura, Maisie, and Owen, all holding hands under a lopsided yellow sun. "That's us," she announced proudly. "And look, Daddy, I drew the new swing set, too." I looked at the drawing and saw something behind the house that could have been a swing set, or a spider, or a helicopter. With 5-year-old art, interpretation is generous. "Who put up a swing set?" I asked. "Uncle Kevin fixed the old one," Maisie said casually, already reaching for another crayon. I looked at Laura. She was folding laundry on the other end of the couch and didn't look up. "The neighbor," she said. "Kevin Morrow. He lives a couple streets over. The swing set was leaning pretty bad after that wind we had, and he offered to straighten it out. He's handy." I nodded. It made sense. I'd been meaning to fix that swing set for 2 months, and 2 months in our house meant it wasn't going to happen until I ran out of other excuses. The next morning, I noticed a few things that I filed away without thinking. There was a coffee mug in the dish rack that I didn't recognize. Dark blue ceramic, heavier than anything we owned, with no logo or design on it. "New mug?" I asked. Laura glanced at it. "Oh, I think Lisa brought it over when she came for coffee last week. I keep forgetting to give it back." I nodded and poured my coffee into my usual mug. Later, in the bathroom, I caught a scent I couldn't place. Something cologne-like, faint, underneath the usual mix of Laura's shampoo and the kids' bubble bath. "Did you get a new air freshener?" I called out. "Yeah, one of those plug-in ones," she called back from the bedroom. The old one ran out. These were nothing details. A mug, a smell. The kind of things you'd never notice if you were home every day, because they'd accumulate gradually. But when you leave for a week and come back, changes stand out, even small ones. The problem is, I noticed them and then immediately dismissed them because I trusted my wife completely, the way you trust the ground beneath a house you've lived in for years. You don't check the foundation, you just assume it's solid. On Tuesday, my last full day home before the next run, I was in the garage looking for a socket wrench when I noticed something on the workbench. A pair of work gloves. Leather, size large, well worn. They weren't mine. I wore XL, and my work gloves were canvas, not leather. I picked them up and turned them over. They had the kind of wear pattern you get from electrical work. Scorch marks on the thumb and index finger, calluses worn into the palm. I almost called out to Laura to ask about them, but something stopped me. Instead, I put them back exactly where I'd found them and went inside. Over lunch, I mentioned casually that the garage was getting cluttered and asked if anyone had been in there recently. Laura shrugged. Kevin borrowed a ladder a couple weeks ago. Maybe he left something. I'll ask him. She said it the way you'd mention a mailman or a plumber, someone functional, someone who exists in the background of daily life. I let it go. And the next morning, I loaded my bag into the cab, kissed my kids, kissed my wife, and drove 700 miles east without asking a single follow-up question. That run took me to a warehouse complex outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. 6 days of highway, truck stops, loading docks, and the same AM radio preachers promising salvation at 2 in the morning. I called home every night. The conversations were identical. Kids are fine. Work was work. Miss you. Drive safe. On the 4th night, Maisie asked to talk to me. She told me about a bird that had built a nest outside her window, and about how Kevin had lifted her up so she could see the eggs inside. "He's really tall, Daddy," she said. "Taller than you, I think." I laughed and said, "Nobody's taller than me, Peanut." But after we hung up, I sat in the dark cab with the engine idling and replayed the conversation. Uncle Kevin, who fixed the swing set. Kevin, who borrowed a ladder. Kevin, who lifted my daughter to see a bird's nest. How often was this man at my house? And why did my 5-year-old know him well enough to call him by his first name? I want to be honest about something. At that point, I wasn't suspicious. Not really. I wasn't imagining my wife in bed with another man or constructing theories about betrayal. The thought was simpler and more primal than that. It was territorial. Another man was spending time in my house, with my kids, doing the things I should have been doing, fixing swings, lifting daughters, being present. And I wasn't there to do any of it because I was sitting in a parking lot in Harrisburg eating a microwave burrito and staring at a concrete wall. The feeling wasn't jealousy yet. It was something closer to guilt, mixed with a vague unease I couldn't name. Like standing at the edge of a swimming pool in the dark and knowing the water is deep but not knowing exactly how deep. I told myself to stop overthinking it. Kevin was a neighbor. Neighbors help out. That's what people do in small towns. I finished my burrito, brushed my teeth with a bottle of water, and climbed into the bunk. I was asleep in 5 minutes. But I dreamed about my house, and in the dream, someone else was mowing the lawn. The Harrisburg run got cut short. My load was supposed to include a second drop at a warehouse in Allentown, but the receiving dock had a scheduling conflict and pushed it to the following week. My dispatcher called me Friday morning and told me to deadhead back, run empty, straight home, pick up a new assignment Monday. It meant I'd be back a full day earlier than planned. I didn't call Laura. It was 7 a.m. and she'd be in the middle of the morning chaos, getting Maisie dressed for daycare, wrestling Owen into his car seat, trying to eat a granola bar while brushing her hair. I figured I'd surprise them. Pull into the driveway in the afternoon, grab the kids, maybe take everyone out for pizza. It was the kind of small, good idea that only a man who's rarely home would think of as special, and that should tell you something about the state of my marriage. I made good time, crossed back into our state around noon, stopped for diesel and a sandwich at the truck stop off exit 42, and rolled into our neighborhood just after 2 in the afternoon. It was a Friday, so Laura would be at work until 5:30. Then she'd pick up the kids from daycare and fight the crosstown traffic home. They wouldn't be back until close to 7. I'd have the whole afternoon to shower, maybe start dinner, really lean into the surprise. That was the plan. But when I turned onto our street and the house came into view, the plan evaporated. There was a pickup truck parked in my driveway. Not behind my minivan, not on the street where a visitor would park. In the driveway, in the spot where my rig would go if it fit. A dark gray Chevy Silverado, not new but well maintained, with a toolbox bolted behind the cab and a ladder rack on top. An electrician's truck. I pulled over 3 houses down and sat there with the engine running, staring at it. There were a dozen explanations. Laura had called someone to fix the wiring in the basement. She'd mentioned a flickering light last week. A friend was borrowing the driveway while their street was being repaved. The neighbor Kevin was doing some repair and needed a flat surface to park on. Any of these would have been perfectly reasonable. But something about the way that truck was parked, not politely off to the side, not angled for a quick exit, but centered and comfortable. The way you park at a place where you belong made my stomach tighten. I checked the time. 2:15 p.m. Laura should be at work. The kids should be at daycare. So who is in my house? I sat in my rig for maybe 10 minutes, arguing with myself. The reasonable voice said, "Go home, walk in, find out it's a repairman, feel stupid, and enjoy your weekend." The other voice, the one that had been whispering since the mug and the gloves and the cologne, said, "Don't announce yourself. Not yet." I drove past the house slowly, turned at the end of the block, and parked on the next street over where I couldn't be seen from our windows. Then I walked back on foot, cutting through the Hendersons' backyard the way I used to when I was running late for the morning shift years ago. I came around to the side of my house and stopped at the kitchen window. The blinds were half open. Through them, I could see the kitchen. Dishes in the sink, a pot on the stove, 2 coffee mugs on the counter. 2 mugs. One of them was the dark blue ceramic that Laura had said belonged to Lisa. The living room was visible through the pass-through above the counter. The TV was off. The lights were on. And then I heard it. A voice. Male. Low and relaxed, the kind of tone you use when you're comfortable in a space, not the voice of a plumber making small talk while he tightens a pipe. Then Laura's voice, laughing at something he said. Then silence. Then a sound that I will not describe because some things don't need words to be understood. I could have walked in. The back door was unlocked. Laura never locked it during the day, a habit I'd ask her to break 100 times. I could have turned the handle, stepped inside, and confronted whatever was happening 20 feet from where I stood. Part of me wanted to. The part that was raised by a man who settled things with his hands and his voice and didn't waste time on strategy. But another part of me, the part that had learned patience on 10,000 miles of empty highway, said no. Not like this. Not without knowing exactly what I was dealing with. If I walked in now, it would be chaos. Screaming, crying, denials, maybe violence. And my kids would come home from daycare in an hour and walk into the aftermath. I wasn't going to let that happen. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I turned around, walked back through the Hendersons' yard, got into my rig, and drove away. I didn't go home that night. I parked at the truck stop off exit 42, the same one where I'd eaten a sandwich 3 hours earlier, feeling good about the world. And I sat in the dark cab, watching the lot lights flicker and trying to figure out what to do with the fact that my wife had another man in my house on a Friday afternoon while my children were at daycare. The truck stop at exit 42 is the loneliest place I know. During the day it's busy, rigs pulling in and out, drivers grabbing coffee, the fuel island humming with diesel pumps. But at night, it empties out. The restaurant closes at 9, the store at 10, and after that, it's just a dark parking lot full of sleeping trucks, their engines idling in a low chorus that sounds like the whole world breathing. I'd slept here 100 times on the way to or from a run, but I'd never sat here at midnight knowing my wife was in bed with another man 20 miles away, in the same house where my children were sleeping, in the same bed where we'd made those children. The cab that had always felt like a comfortable cocoon now felt like a coffin. I couldn't lie down. I couldn't close my eyes. I just sat behind the wheel with the engine off and the windows cracked, staring at the orange glow of the lot lights on the wet asphalt and trying to keep my breathing steady. I thought about my father. He was a long-haul man too. Drove for 31 years before his back gave out, and he retired to a recliner and cable news. My mother waited for him the way Laura waited for me, or the way I assumed she waited. Kept the house, raised the kids, handled everything alone 5 days out of 7. I never once heard her complain, and I never once heard him thank her for it. That was just how things worked. The man earns, the woman manages, and nobody talks about the gap in between. When I was 12, I asked my mother if she ever got lonely when Dad was on the road. She looked at me like I'd asked if water was wet. "Of course I do," she said. "But lonely isn't the same as alone. Alone is temporary. Lonely is when someone's right next to you and still not there." I didn't understand what she meant at the time. Sitting in that dark cab 22 years later, I understood it perfectly. Laura hadn't just been alone. She'd been lonely. Lonely in a marriage where her husband was physically absent most of the time and emotionally absent for the rest of it. I'm not making excuses for her. What she did was a betrayal, and no amount of loneliness justifies it. But I'm trying to be honest about the conditions I created, because if I'm not honest about that, then this story is just another tale of a cheating wife, and it's more complicated than that. I had a wife who asked me 3 months ago to fix the swing set, and I didn't. I had a wife who told me the kitchen faucet was dripping, and I said I'd get to it next time I was home, and next time I was home I watched football instead. I had a wife who stopped saying, "I love you" on the phone, and I noticed but didn't ask why. I didn't create what happened in that house on Friday afternoon. That was her choice, and she owns it. But I built the empty space that someone else walked into, and I own that. Around 1 in the morning, I called Tommy Bishop. He picked up on the third ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. "This better be good, Cole." I told him everything. The truck in the driveway, the 2 mugs, the sounds through the window, the walk through the Hendersons' yard, and the drive back to the truck stop. Tommy listened without interrupting, which for Tommy was the equivalent of a standing ovation. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he said, "Okay, first thing, you did right by not going in. I kicked in the door both times. First time, I threw her boyfriend through a glass table and spent a night in county. Second time, I punched a hole in the drywall, scared my kid, and my wife used it in court to get full custody. Both times I lost. You hear me? Both times I lost because I let my hands do the thinking." He paused again. "Second thing, don't confront her yet. You go home tomorrow like nothing happened. Smile, kiss her, play with the kids. Let her think you have no idea. And while you're doing that, you get your ducks in a row." I asked him what that meant. "It means evidence," he said. "Right now you've got a truck in a driveway and sounds through a window. That's nothing in court. A good lawyer will say you misheard, you were tired, you're paranoid. You need proof she can't deny and a judge can't ignore. Recordings, photos, timestamps. You need a lawyer who specializes in custody, and you need to figure out who this guy is. Full name, address, how long it's been going on. Because here's the thing, Jason. This isn't about her anymore. This is about your kids. If you blow up now, she'll get the house, she'll get primary custody, and you'll be a weekend dad paying child support while some electrician sits in your chair reading bedtime stories to your son." That last image hit me harder than anything else Tommy had said. Because it wasn't hypothetical, it was already happening. The only difference was that right now the electrician left before I came home. If I didn't handle this right, he'd never have to leave again. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the cab and made a list in the Notes app on my phone. It wasn't long, but it was specific. 1. Go home tomorrow as planned. Act normal. 2. Install a camera somewhere in the house where Laura won't find it. 3. Find out Kevin Morrow's full name and address. 4. Call a family lawyer on Monday. 5. Tell no one except Tommy. I read the list back to myself 3 times, then locked my phone and leaned back in the seat. Outside, a rig pulled into the lot, its headlights sweeping across my windshield like a lighthouse beam. The driver parked 2 spots over, killed his engine, and went dark. Just another man alone in a box on wheels, waiting for morning. I wondered if he was running from something too, or if he was just tired. I envied him either way. By dawn, I had a plan, and the plan was the only thing keeping me from driving back to that house and doing something I'd regret for the rest of my life. I drove home Saturday morning with the windows down and the radio off. Pulled into the driveway at 9 like I was returning from a normal run, bag over my shoulder, same tired smile I always wore after a week on the road. Laura was making pancakes. Maisie was on the floor coloring. Owen was in his high chair mashing a banana with both fists. It looked like a postcard, the kind of scene you'd see in an advertisement for family life. Warm light through the kitchen window, syrup on the table, a child's laughter in the background. Laura turned when she heard the door and said, "Hey, you're early." She kissed me. Her lips tasted like coffee. I kissed her back and said the run got cut short. She said that was nice. I picked up Owen and he smeared banana across my cheek. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly the way it had always been. And standing in that kitchen, holding my son, smelling pancakes and banana and my wife's shampoo, I almost convinced myself that Friday hadn't happened. That the truck in the driveway and the sounds through the window had been a dream, a hallucination born from too many hours behind the wheel. But it wasn't a dream, and the proof was right there in front of me if I knew where to look. I didn't rush it. I had 3 days at home before the next run, and I used them carefully. On Saturday afternoon, while Laura took the kids to the grocery store, I went through the house with new eyes. Not ransacking drawers or flipping through her phone. I wasn't going to tip her off. I was looking for the small things, the traces a person leaves in a space when they think nobody's watching. In the bedroom, I checked the nightstand on my side of the bed. The drawer was the same. My old watch, a paperback I'd never finished, a phone charger. But the nightstand on Laura's side had been rearranged. Her reading glasses, which she usually kept on top, were in the drawer. A candle I'd never seen before sat in their place. The sheets smelled clean. She'd done laundry recently, which wasn't unusual, but there was a faint trace of something beneath the detergent. Not cologne exactly, more like skin. Another person's warmth baked into the fabric and then washed away. Almost, but not quite. I might have been imagining it. I don't think I was. In the garage, the leather work gloves were gone. Either Laura had returned them to Kevin, or she'd realized they shouldn't be there when I was home. The ladder was back in its brackets on the wall. I checked the mileage on the minivan. Laura drove it for everything: work, daycare, errands. I hadn't thought to check it before, but I wrote down the number on a scrap of paper and tucked it in my wallet. If the mileage jumped more than her usual weekly routine could explain while I was on my next run, it would tell me she was driving somewhere extra. I also checked the radio presets. Every car has them. The stations you listen to most, saved to the buttons so you don't have to search. Laura's presets had always been the same: a pop station, a country station, NPR, and a Christian rock station she'd listened to since high school. Button 4 was different now. It was tuned to a classic rock station. Laura hated classic rock. She'd told me a dozen times that it all sounded like the same guitar solo repeated for 40 years. Someone else had been driving her car, or at least sitting in the passenger seat long enough to change a preset. Sunday evening, after the kids were in bed, I told Laura I needed to run to the hardware store for a part. The bathroom faucet was still dripping, and I wanted to fix it before I left on Tuesday. She barely looked up from her phone. "Okay, get some light bulbs too, the porch one's out." I drove to the hardware store, bought the faucet washer and the light bulbs, and then stopped at an electronics store on the way back. I paid cash for a small Wi-Fi camera, the kind people use for home security or baby monitors. It was about the size of a deck of cards, recorded in HD, had a wide-angle lens, and could be accessed remotely through an app on my phone. It had night vision and motion-activated recording with cloud storage. $63. I bought it without hesitating, the way you buy something you've already decided on before you walk through the door. Back home, I fixed the faucet. It took 10 minutes and a 5-cent rubber washer, which made me feel even worse about not doing it 3 months ago, and then replaced the porch light bulb. While Laura showered, I installed the camera. I put it on the bookshelf in the living room, tucked between a photo frame and a stack of Maisie's board books. The lens pointed toward the front door, the hallway, and the kitchen entrance. Anyone coming in or out of the house would be captured. I angled it carefully, tested the view on my phone, and adjusted it twice until I was satisfied. The camera was small enough and dark enough that you'd never notice it unless you were looking for it. I connected it to the cloud account I'd set up with a separate email, one Laura didn't know about, and enabled motion alerts so I'd get a notification on my phone whenever someone entered the frame. Then I put the board books back on either side and stepped back. It looked completely natural. Just a shelf full of family things, a framed photo of the kids, a camera that wasn't supposed to be there, and a stack of picture books about friendly bears and sharing. I stood there looking at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of what I was doing. I was turning my home into a surveillance site. I was setting a trap for my own wife. There was nothing noble about it, nothing righteous. It was just a man who needed to see the truth on a screen because he couldn't stand to hear it through a wall again. On Monday, I called a family lawyer. I found one in the next town over, far enough that nobody from our circle would see my truck in the parking lot. Her name was Janet Voss, and she had the kind of voice that made you feel like everything could be handled if you stayed calm and followed the steps. I told her my situation without going into emotional detail. Married 9 years, 2 kids. I suspected my wife was having an affair. I wanted to know my options regarding divorce and custody. She asked if I had evidence. I told her about the truck, the sounds, and the camera I'd just installed. She said the camera footage would help, but warned me that in our state, recording someone in their home without consent existed in a legal gray area. She recommended I focus on documenting patterns, dates, times, the man's identity, and said the strongest custody argument would be demonstrating stability and involvement as a father. The courts aren't interested in punishing infidelity, she said. They're interested in what's best for the children. Your job is to show that you're the parent who prioritizes them. I thanked her, paid a retainer, and drove to the depot to pick up my next assignment. Tuesday morning, I kissed Laura and the kids goodbye and pulled out of the driveway. In my pocket was a phone with a camera app that would show me everything that happened in my living room while I was gone. I didn't want to watch, but I was going to. The first alert came on Tuesday evening at 6:47 p.m. I was at a rest area in Indiana, eating a ham sandwich out of a plastic wrapper, when my phone buzzed. Motion detected. I opened the app and watched the live feed. It was Laura, coming through the front door with the kids. Maisie kicked off her shoes and ran out of frame. Owen was on Laura's hip, half asleep. She put him down on the couch, disappeared into the kitchen, and came back a few minutes later with something in her hand, a sippy cup, probably. A completely ordinary evening. She turned on the TV, sat down next to Owen, and Maisie came back into frame carrying a coloring book. They looked peaceful. They looked like my family. I watched for about 20 minutes, then closed the app and stared at the ceiling of my bunk. I felt dirty. Not because of what I might see, but because of what I was doing. Spying on my own wife and children through a hidden camera, watching them live their life without me from 400 miles away. Wednesday was the same. Laura came home, fed the kids, put them to bed around 8. She sat on the couch for a while scrolling through her phone. then turned off the lights and went to the bedroom, which was outside the camera's range. No visitors. No Kevin. I started to wonder if Friday had been a one-time thing, a mistake she was already regretting, something that would never happen again. Part of me hoped for that, hoped I'd watch 5 days of empty evenings and go home with nothing but guilt about the camera and a marriage I could still fix if I tried hard enough. But Tommy's voice was in my head. They don't stop. They just get better at hiding it. The only question is whether they hide it well enough. I kept watching. Thursday evening, the alert came at 7:12 p.m. Laura and the kids, same as before. Shoes off, TV on, the routine. But at 7:38, another alert. The front door opened. A man walked in. He didn't knock. He didn't ring the bell. He opened the door with the casual confidence of someone who had a key, or at least knew the door would be unlocked. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, work boots, a baseball cap. Medium build, about my height, maybe a little leaner. He wiped his boots on the mat, my mat, and called out something I couldn't hear because the camera only picked up audio within a few feet. But I could see Laura's reaction. She looked up from the couch, smiled, and said something back. Not the polite smile you give a neighbor who stops by. The easy, familiar smile you give someone you've been waiting for. Maisie ran to him. She threw her arms around his legs the way she threw her arms around mine when I came home from a run. He picked her up, swung her onto his hip, and carried her into the kitchen where Laura was already pulling another plate from the cabinet. I watched them eat dinner at my table. Kevin sat in the chair at the head, my chair. Laura sat to his left, where she always sat. Maisie was across from them, talking with her hands the way she does when she's excited. Owen was in his high chair, and at one point Kevin leaned over and wiped something off his face with a napkin. It was such a small gesture. The kind of thing a father does without thinking, sees food on his kid's chin, wipes it off, goes back to eating. Except Owen wasn't his kid. That was my son. That was my high chair, my table, my napkin. And this man was sitting in the center of my family like a puzzle piece that had been quietly swapped in while I was 700 miles away hauling somebody else's freight. I gripped my phone so hard the case cracked along the edge. My jaw ached from clenching, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for nearly a minute. After dinner, Kevin helped clear the table. He washed dishes while Laura dried, a synchronized routine that spoke of repetition, of many evenings just like this one. Then they moved to the living room. Laura put on a movie for the kids, something animated, and Kevin sat on the couch with Owen on his lap and Maisie tucked under his arm. Laura sat next to him, her head resting against his shoulder. They looked like a family. That's the sentence I keep coming back to, the one that hurts more than anything else in this story. They didn't look like a woman and her secret lover sneaking around behind her husband's back. They looked like a family, relaxed, comfortable, domestic. The kind of scene you'd see through any window on any street in any town in America. At 8:30, Laura took the kids to their rooms. Kevin stayed on the couch. When she came back, maybe 20 minutes later, she sat down next to him and he put his arm around her. They talked quietly. I couldn't hear the words. Then she leaned up and kissed him, slowly, softly, the way you kiss someone you love, not someone you're sneaking around with. The lights went off a few minutes later, and they walked together toward the hallway that led to the bedroom. My bedroom. After that, the living room was dark and empty. The camera recorded nothing but the faint glow of the power light on the TV. I sat in my bunk in a truck stop parking lot somewhere in Indiana and cried. I'm not going to dress that up or explain it away. I'm a 34-year-old man who has changed tires in snowstorms and delivered loads through tornado warnings and never once felt sorry for himself. But watching another man kiss my wife in my living room, after tucking my children into bed in my house, broke something in me that I didn't know could break. It wasn't rage. That would come later. It was grief. Pure, heavy, suffocating grief for a life that I suddenly understood had been over for a long time before I realized it. I cried until my chest hurt. Then I washed my face with bottled water, called Tommy, and said 4 words. It's worse than I thought. Tommy didn't say much that night. He listened to me describe what I'd seen on the camera, the door opening without a knock, the dinner, the dishes, the kids on the couch, the kiss, the hallway. When I was done, there was a long silence. Then he said, "How many nights?" I told him I'd only watched 1 full evening so far. "Keep recording," he said. "You need a pattern, not a snapshot. 1 night is a visit. 5 nights is a life. A judge needs to see that this isn't some guy who dropped by once. It's a man who's living in your house while you're working to pay for it." He was right, and I knew it. But the thought of watching more of those evenings, sitting in a parking lot somewhere in America while Kevin Morrow ate dinner at my table and read stories to my kids, made me want to rip the steering wheel off the column. I watched every night for the rest of that run. Friday. Kevin came at 6:50, earlier than Thursday, carrying a grocery bag. He cooked dinner, not Laura. He stood at my stove, in my kitchen, and made what looked like spaghetti while Laura sat at the counter with a glass of wine, talking to him. The kids were in the living room, watching TV. It was so domestic, so unremarkable, that if you didn't know the context, you'd think it was the most boring footage in the world. Saturday. He arrived in the morning, around 9. He stayed the entire day. They took the kids somewhere, out of camera range, and came back in the late afternoon. Owen was asleep on Kevin's shoulder when they walked through the door. Kevin carried him to his room while Laura took Maisie inside. When they came back to the living room, they collapsed on the couch together, tired the way parents get tired after a day out with small children. Sunday. He left early. 7:15 a.m. I watched him put on his boots at the front door, lean back to kiss Laura in the hallway, and walk out. He'd stayed the night. The whole night. In my bed, next to my wife, in the house I was still making payments on. I kept a log. I wrote down every time Kevin entered and exited the house, what he did while he was there, how the kids interacted with him. I noted when he carried Owen, when he played with Maisie, when he and Laura touched, a hand on the back, a kiss on the cheek, the way they sat close on the couch with no space between them. It was clinical, methodical work, the kind of documentation my lawyer had asked for. But underneath the clinical surface, every entry was a wound. Tuesday, 7:41 p.m., Kay arrives. Maisie runs to greet him. He lifts her up. Thursday, 8:15 p.m., Kay and Elle sit on couch, his arm around her. She leans into him. Saturday, 9:03 a.m., Kay enters with donuts. Kids cheer. Each line in that log was a small death. Each one was a moment in my children's lives that should have included me and didn't, replaced by a man who had no right to be there but had somehow become part of the furniture. The road became unbearable. I'd always loved driving. The rhythm of the highway, the solitude, the feeling of covering ground while the rest of the world sat still. Now every mile felt like a mile further from my children, and a mile closer to madness. I replayed the footage constantly, forwarding and rewinding, studying Kevin's face for something I could hate, a cruelty, an arrogance, a sign that he was using Laura or neglecting the kids. But there was nothing. He was patient with Maisie. He was gentle with Owen. He cleaned up after dinner and took out the trash. He was, by every visible measure, a decent man doing a decent job of being present for a woman and 2 children who needed someone present. And that was the worst part. If he'd been a drunk or a creep or a deadbeat, I could have felt righteous. Instead, I just felt replaced. Tommy called me every night to check in. He could hear it in my voice, the slow erosion, the anger turning inward. "You're close to the edge," he said one night when I was parked outside a warehouse in Columbus waiting for a morning delivery. "I can hear it. You're going to do something stupid if you don't set a date. I asked him what he meant. A date for the confrontation, he said. You've got enough footage. You've got the lawyer. You've got the log. Pick a day, go home, and end this. Because if you keep watching that camera for another 2 weeks, you're going to lose your mind before you ever get to the courtroom. He was right. The footage was eating me alive, one evening at a time. I had 12 days of recordings, dozens of entries in the log, and enough evidence to show any judge that Kevin Morrow wasn't a friendly neighbor who helped with the swing set. He was a man who had moved into my marriage while I was on the road. I picked a date. Next Tuesday. I'd leave for my run as usual, but I wouldn't go to the depot. I'd circle back, check into the motel on Route 9, and wait for Kevin to walk through my front door one last time. I called my lawyer that afternoon and told her the plan. Janet Voss listened, then said, I need you to promise me something. No violence, no shouting, no breaking things. You walk in, you state what you know, and you leave. If he's in the house, you ask him to go. If he doesn't go, you call the police. It's your home. Your name is on the deed. But you do not touch him, because the moment you lay a hand on him, you go from wronged husband to defendant, and everything you've built, the footage, the log, the custody case, falls apart. I told her I understood. She said, say it back to me. So I did. No violence, no shouting. State what I know. Leave if necessary. Call the police if he won't. She said good. I hung up and sat in the cab for a long time, gripping the wheel with both hands, feeling the leather creak under my fingers. I had 6 more days of driving before Tuesday. 6 more days of highway and truck stops and gas station sandwiches, and a phone in my pocket showing me a life I no longer belonged to. I put the truck in gear and pulled onto the highway. The road stretched out ahead of me, flat and gray and endless, the way it always had. But for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't counting the miles until home. I was counting the miles until the end. I came home on Saturday, before the planned Tuesday. Not to confront anyone. I still had the date marked and the plan in place. I came home because I missed my kids so badly that the ache had become physical, a tightness in my chest that wouldn't loosen no matter how deep I breathed. I needed to hold them. I needed to smell Owen's hair and hear Maisie's voice telling me about birds and bugs and whatever else had captured her attention that week. I also needed to do something harder. I needed to listen, really listen, to what my children were telling me about the man who had been sharing their evenings while I was gone. Not because I was building a case anymore, because I was their father, and I'd been so focused on evidence and lawyers and camera footage that I'd almost forgotten the most important part. My kids were living inside this mess, and they had no idea it was a mess at all. Saturday was a warm day for early April. I took the kids to the park after lunch while Laura stayed home to clean. It was one of those rare afternoons where I had both of them to myself. No distractions, no TV, no schedule. Maisie went straight for the swings and demanded I push her higher. Owen toddled around the sandbox with the serious expression of a man inspecting a construction site. I pushed Maisie for a while, then sat on the bench and watched them both. After a few minutes, Maisie ran over and climbed onto the bench next to me, out of breath and red-cheeked. "Daddy, when you're driving your truck, do you sleep in it?" she asked. "Sometimes," I said. "It has a little bed behind the seats." She considered this. "Kevin says truck drivers are brave because they drive all night when everyone else is sleeping." I kept my voice even. "Does Kevin talk about me?" Maisie shrugged. "Sometimes. He says you work really hard." I nodded slowly. "What else does Kevin do when he comes over?" She talked for 10 minutes straight. I didn't interrupt her once. According to Maisie, Kevin came over a lot. She couldn't say how often in numbers, but she described it in events. Kevin made mac and cheese from scratch, not the box kind. Kevin let her sit on his lap while he fixed the garbage disposal. Kevin taught her how to shuffle a deck of cards. Kevin watched princess movies with her and didn't complain about it. Kevin carried Owen around the backyard on his shoulders and made airplane noises. Kevin and Mommy sometimes danced in the kitchen when they thought the kids were in bed. Maisie had seen them once through the crack in her door. It was slow dancing, she said, with the disgusted fascination that only a 5-year-old can manage. Like on the old movies Grandma watches. Every sentence was a nail. But I didn't flinch, and I didn't ask leading questions. I just sat there on that park bench in the sun, watching my daughter describe another man's life inside my family, and I let her talk until she ran out of things to say. Then Owen did something that nearly broke me. He'd been playing in the sandbox the whole time, quietly building and destroying little mounds of sand. He stood up, walked over to me on his unsteady 3-year-old legs, and held up a plastic shovel. "Daddy fix," he said. The shovel had a crack in the handle. I took it, looked at it, and said, "I don't think I can fix this one, buddy. We'll get you a new one." Owen looked at me for a moment, then said, "Kevin, fix it." Not meanly, not as a comparison. He was 3 years old. He didn't understand what those 2 words meant to me. He was simply stating a fact from his tiny universe. When something was broken, Kevin fixed it. Kevin was the man who was there when things needed fixing. I was the man who came and went. I hugged my son and pressed my face into his hair, and he squirmed because he wanted to get back to his sand. I let him go and sat on that bench for a long time, watching both of them play, with the sun on my face and something cold and heavy settling in my chest. That evening, after the kids were asleep, I sat in the garage with the door open, drinking a beer and looking at the street. Laura was inside watching TV. We'd barely spoken all day, not out of hostility, just out of the comfortable silence that had become our default setting years ago. The silence I used to think was peaceful and now understood was just empty. I thought about what Maisie had told me. Kevin says truck drivers are brave. Kevin makes mac and cheese from scratch. Kevin and Mommy dance in the kitchen. My daughter had described a man who was kind, present, and involved. A man who did all the things I should have done but didn't, because I was always on the road, always chasing the next load, always telling myself that the money I earned was the same thing as love. It wasn't. I'd confused providing with parenting, and the result was that my children had found a parent who actually showed up. That realization hurt worse than the footage on the camera, worse than the sounds through the window, worse than anything in this entire story. Because the footage showed me my wife's betrayal. But my daughter's words, spoken innocently on a park bench on a sunny afternoon, showed me my own. I drained the beer, crushed the can, and went inside. Laura was on the couch, her phone face down on the cushion beside her. I sat in the armchair across from her, not Kevin's spot, the other one. The one nobody sat in because it was too far from the TV. She looked at me and said, "You okay? You've been quiet today." I almost told her. The words were right there, stacked up behind my teeth like cars at a traffic light. I know about Kevin. I've seen the camera footage. I've watched him eat at our table and sleep in our bed and carry our son on his shoulders. I know everything. But I didn't say it. Because Tuesday was 3 days away, and the plan was the plan. So I said, "Just tired. Long run." She nodded and went back to her phone, and I sat in that armchair staring at the wall, rehearsing in my head the 6 words I was going to say when I walked through the front door on Tuesday evening and found Kevin Morrow sitting in my chair. Comfortable chair, isn't it, Kevin? Tuesday morning, I performed the ritual one last time. Bag over the shoulder, thermos of coffee, kiss Maisie on the forehead while she ate cereal, pick up Owen, hold him close, put him back in the high chair, kiss Laura on the cheek. "Back Saturday," I said. "Drive safe," she said. The same words, the same cadence, the same goodbye we'd exchanged 100 times. I walked out the front door, threw my bag in the cab, and backed out of the driveway. I could see Laura through the kitchen window, already clearing the breakfast dishes, already moving on to the next task in a day that didn't include me. I drove to the end of the block, turned left, and instead of heading for the highway, I took the back road to Route 9. The Pinecrest Motel was a 12-unit strip with peeling paint and a neon sign that buzzed like a trapped hornet. I paid for 2 nights in cash and parked around back where the truck couldn't be seen from the road. Then I went inside, sat on the bed, and waited. The motel room smelled like disinfectant and carpet dust. There was a TV bolted to the dresser and a Bible in the nightstand drawer with someone's phone number written inside the cover. I turned on the TV for noise, muted it, and opened the camera app on my phone. The living room of my house was empty. Laura had already left for work. The kids were at daycare. I stared at the empty room for a long time. My couch. My bookshelf. The framed photo of Maisie and Owen that sat next to a hidden camera. I closed the app and lay back on the bed. The ceiling had a water stain shaped like a boot. I stared at it for hours. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, running the confrontation through my head like a film I was editing. Walk in. Say the words. Stay calm. Don't touch him. Don't raise your voice. Let the silence do the work. I must have rehearsed it 50 times. Each time the fantasy tried to steer toward violence, my fist connecting with his jaw, his body going backward into the wall, I pulled it back. Janet Voss's voice in my head. The moment you lay a hand on him, everything falls apart. At 6:47 p.m., the motion alert buzzed. Laura and the kids. Same routine. Shoes off, TV on, kitchen. I watched on the small screen, my thumb hovering over the app, my whole body rigid. At 7:22, another alert. The front door opened. Kevin walked in, boots off, cap on the hook. He called something toward the kitchen, and Laura appeared in the frame, smiling. Maisie came running. He picked her up. They disappeared into the kitchen together. It was happening. One more time, one final time, the same scene I'd watched play out on that screen for weeks. I closed the app, stood up, and looked at myself in the motel bathroom mirror. I looked terrible, unshaven, red-eyed, wearing the same shirt I'd put on that morning. I splashed water on my face, dried it with a towel that smelled like bleach, and put on a clean shirt from my bag. I didn't know why I was changing my shirt to confront my wife's lover. Maybe I wanted to look like a man who still had his life together. Maybe I just needed one thing that felt under control. I drove to the house with the windows up and the radio off. It was a 10-minute drive from the motel, the longest 10 minutes of my life. I parked on the street this time, right behind Kevin's gray Silverado. I wanted him to see my truck when he left. I wanted him to know I wasn't hiding anymore. I sat in the cab for maybe 3 minutes, hands on the wheel, breathing slow and deliberate. Then I got out, walked up the path I'd walked 1,000 times, and opened my own front door. The hallway smelled like garlic and tomato sauce. Music was playing softly from the kitchen, classic rock, the same station that had been programmed into Laura's car. I could hear the kids' voices, and Kevin's laugh, and the clatter of plates being set down. I walked through the hallway, past the framed wedding photo on the wall, past the kids' height marks penciled on the doorframe, past the bookshelf where the camera was still recording, and stepped into the living room. Kevin was in my chair. Not the couch, the recliner. The one I'd picked out 4 years ago at a furniture clearance sale. The one with the lever on the right side that stuck if you pulled it too fast. He was leaned back in it with Owen on his chest, both of them watching something on his phone. Owen was in pajamas already. Someone had given him a bath. In the kitchen, through the open pass-through, Laura was at the stove and Maisie was sitting at the counter drawing. It was the most normal scene in the world. a family at home on a Tuesday evening. Except the man in the chair wasn't the father, and the father was standing 6 feet away in his own living room, watching all of it with a heart that had already broken so many times there was nothing left to break. Kevin noticed me first. His eyes came up from the phone and locked onto mine, and in the half-second before anyone spoke, I saw it all cross his face. Surprise, then recognition, then fear. He knew who I was. He'd seen photos. He'd probably sat in this very chair and looked at the wedding picture on the wall. He knew, and I knew, and for one frozen moment, the only person in that room who didn't know what was happening was my 3-year-old son, who was still lying on the chest of a man who wasn't his father. I looked at Kevin. He looked at me. Owen, sensing the shift, turned his head and saw me. "Daddy!" he said, and reached out his arms. I walked over, lifted my son off Kevin's chest, and held him. He wrapped his arms around my neck and said, "Daddy home early!" I kissed the top of his head and set him down gently on the couch. Then I turned back to Kevin, who was sitting upright now, both feet on the floor, his face the color of wet cement. From the kitchen, I heard Laura's voice go silent. She had seen me. I heard a plate being set down slowly, carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are shaking. Maisie called out, "Daddy?" I kept my eyes on Kevin. He opened his mouth to say something, but I spoke first. 6 words. The 6 words I'd been rehearsing for days in a motel room, and a truck cab, and a park bench, and a garage with the door open. I said them quietly, almost gently, the way you'd talk to someone sitting in a seat that doesn't belong to them on a bus. Comfortable chair, isn't it, Kevin? The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. It felt like 4 years. Kevin stood up from the recliner slowly, the way a man stands when he knows any sudden movement could get him hit. He was about my height, like I'd guessed from the camera, but leaner, with calloused hands and a sunburn on the back of his neck. Up close, he looked exactly like what he was, a working man, an ordinary guy. Not a villain from a movie, but a real person standing in a real living room, having the worst moment of his life. I could have hated him more if he'd looked smug or defiant. Instead, he just looked sick. "Jason," he said, and the fact that he knew my name sent a jolt through me. Of course he knew my name. He'd been sleeping in my bed for months. He probably knew which side I slept on and which drawer I kept my socks in. "I think it's time for you to go," I said. My voice was steady, which surprised me, because inside I was vibrating at a frequency that could have shattered glass. Laura appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her face was white. Not the white of embarrassment or surprise, the white of a person watching a building collapse in slow motion, knowing they're inside it. "Jason," she said, "when did you get home?" I finished for her. "I never left." She blinked, processing. Maisie had come to the edge of the kitchen and was standing behind Laura's leg, looking back and forth between the adults with the radar that children develop when they can feel that something is very wrong, but don't have the words for it. I looked at my daughter and softened my voice. "Hey, Peanut, can you take your brother to your room and show him your new drawings? Daddy needs to talk to Mommy." Maisie hesitated, glanced at Kevin, then at Laura, and walked to the couch where Owen was sitting. She took his hand and led him down the hallway. I heard her bedroom door close. Even at 5, she understood that some conversations happen behind closed doors. Kevin reached for his boots. I didn't stop him. He pulled them on without untying the laces, the way you do when you're trying to leave a place as fast as possible. He grabbed his cap from the hook, my hook, by my door, and shoved it on his head. Laura said, "Kevin, wait!" He didn't wait. He looked at me one more time, opened his mouth as if to say something, an apology, an explanation, I'll never know, then closed it and walked out the front door. Through the window, I watched him get into his Silverado, start the engine, and pull away. He didn't look back at the house. I stood at the window and watched until his taillights disappeared at the end of the block, and then it was just me and Laura, and the smell of tomato sauce, and the sound of the classic rock station still playing softly from the kitchen speaker. I walked over and turned it off. The silence was enormous. Laura sat down at the kitchen table. I remained standing. I didn't trust myself to sit. Sitting felt too close to comfortable, and I needed the discomfort to keep me sharp. "How long?" I said. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Since last summer," she said quietly. "Almost a year." Almost a year. 11 months of my wife sharing our home, our bed, our children with another man, while I hauled freight across state lines. 11 months of miss you and drive safe, and phone calls where the kids told me about the funny things Kevin said, and I laughed along without knowing I was laughing at the script of my own replacement. I asked the next question, the one that mattered more than anything about beds or kisses or who cooked dinner. "Do the kids think he's their father?" Laura flinched. "No," she said. "They know who their father is. They know you." "Maisie calls him Uncle Kevin," I said. "Owen asks him to fix things instead of me. He's been here every time I leave. He eats at this table, he sleeps in that bed, he gives my son a bath. So I'm going to ask you again, do my children think he's their father?" She started crying. Not the pretty kind of crying you see in movies. The ugly kind. The kind where your face crumples and your shoulders shake and you can't get words out because something inside you has finally buckled under its own weight. I didn't comfort her. I stood with my arms at my sides and waited. After a minute, she wiped her face with her sleeve and said, "I never wanted this to happen, Jason. I was alone. I was alone every single week, handling everything by myself. The kids, the house, the bills, the car, the groceries, the doctor appointments, the nightmares, the tantrums. You'd call at 10 o'clock and ask how my day was, and I'd say fine because what else was I supposed to say? That I cried in the shower that morning because Owen wouldn't stop screaming and I hadn't slept more than 4 hours and there was nobody to hand him to?" Her voice broke. "Kevin was kind to me. He showed up. That's all he did at first. He just showed up." I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table and put my fist through the drywall, the way Tommy had done, the way my father would have done, the way every man in my bloodline would have handled this moment. But I kept hearing Janet Voss's voice. No violence, no shouting. And I kept seeing Maisie's face as she led Owen down the hallway, her small hand wrapped around his, doing at 5 years old what I should have been doing all along. Taking care of her brother because the adults in the room couldn't be trusted. So instead of screaming, I said, "I'm going to stay at the motel tonight. Tomorrow, I'll come back for some clothes. I've already spoken to a lawyer. She'll be in touch." Laura looked up at me, her eyes swollen and red. "Jason, please. Can we talk about this?" "We just did," I said. I walked down the hallway, opened Maisie's door, and found both kids on the floor looking at a picture book. I knelt down and hugged them both. Maisie asked, "Is Kevin coming back?" I kissed her forehead and said, "That's not something you need to worry about, Peanut." Owen grabbed my sleeve and said, "Daddy stay?" I said, "Daddy has to go to work early, but I'll see you this weekend. I promise." I held them for another minute, then stood up, walked out the front door, and drove back to the Pinecrest Motel. I sat on the bed in that disinfectant-smelling room and stared at the boot-shaped water stain on the ceiling. I didn't cry this time. I was past crying. I was in the place beyond it, the flat gray country where the only thing left to feel is the weight of what comes next. The next 6 weeks were the worst of my life, and I include in that comparison every overnight blizzard, every near miss on the highway, and every Christmas I spent in a truck stop parking lot instead of with my family. I moved out of the motel after 3 days and into a furnished apartment on the other side of town, a 1-bedroom above a laundromat with a view of a parking lot and a kitchen the size of a closet. It was the cheapest thing I could find on short notice that wasn't also a health hazard. I told my dispatcher I needed to come off the long-haul rotation for personal reasons, and he put me on local runs, shorter routes, home every night. The pay was almost half of what I'd been earning on the road. I didn't care. I was done being 700 miles away while my life happened without me. That was the one decision in all of this that I have never regretted. Laura and I communicated through lawyers for the first 2 weeks. Janet Voss handled it with the calm efficiency she'd promised. She filed the divorce petition, outlined a proposed custody arrangement, and submitted a summary of evidence that included the camera footage, my log, and a timeline of Kevin Morrow's presence in the household. Laura's lawyer, a man named Garza, who looked like he'd rather be playing golf, pushed back on the camera recordings. He argued they were obtained without Laura's consent and should be inadmissible. Janet countered that the camera was in a common area of a home I co-owned, and that the recordings documented conduct affecting the welfare of minor children. The judge allowed them. I don't know if that was legally inevitable or if we got lucky. Either way, the footage stayed in the file, and Laura's negotiating position weakened considerably once her lawyer saw what was on it. Kevin Morrow disappeared from Laura's life within a week of the confrontation. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he'd taken a job with an electrical contractor in another county about 90 minutes south. Tommy had predicted exactly this. They never stay when it gets hard. Kevin hadn't been building a life with Laura. He'd been occupying a vacancy. The moment that vacancy came with consequences, a divorce, a custody battle, a husband who had footage of him playing house, he folded and left. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I didn't feel anything about Kevin anymore. He was just a man who had walked through an open door, and the door had been open because I wasn't there to close it. The anger I'd carried toward him on the highway, in the motel, in the moments before I walked into that living room, it faded surprisingly fast. What replaced it was harder to carry, anger at myself. The custody negotiation took most of April and all of May. It was the ugliest part of the process, not because Laura fought dirty, she didn't, but because every conversation about schedules and holidays and pickup times was a reminder that my children's lives were being split down the middle like a log. The final agreement was joint custody. Maisie and Owen would be with Laura during the week, since she had the house and the proximity to daycare and school, and with me on weekends, Friday evening through Sunday night. Holidays would alternate, summers would be split. I could call every evening before bedtime. On paper, it was fair. In practice, it meant I would see my children 4 days a month less than I'd seen them when I was driving long haul. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. I had quit the road to be closer to my kids, and the divorce had put me further away than the road ever had. The first weekend with the kids at my apartment was hard. I'd bought an air mattress for Maisie and a toddler bed from a thrift store for Owen. I'd stocked the fridge with the foods they liked: string cheese, applesauce, the specific brand of chicken nuggets that Owen would eat and no other. Maisie walked in, looked around the small living room, and said, "Where's the TV?" I didn't have one yet. "We're going to do something better than TV," I said, and pulled out a deck of cards. We played Go Fish for an hour. Owen couldn't hold his cards, so he sat on my lap and helped by grabbing random ones and throwing them on the floor. Maisie won every round and announced each victory like she'd won the Super Bowl. That evening, I made mac and cheese, from scratch, not the box kind. I'd looked up a recipe online the night before and practiced it once. It wasn't as good as Kevin's, probably. But it was mine, and I made it with my own hands in my own kitchen for my own children, and when Owen said, "More, Daddy," with cheese on his chin, I wiped it off with a napkin and thought about nothing else in the world except that moment. Saturday night, after they were asleep, Maisie on the air mattress, Owen in the thrift store bed, both of them in a room so small their beds almost touched, I sat on the couch in the dark and called Tommy. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Good," I said. "Mac and cheese. Go fish." Owen threw cards everywhere. Tommy laughed. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh in weeks. "You know what, Cole? You're going to be all right." I wanted to believe him. I wasn't sure yet. But sitting in that apartment above a laundromat, with my children breathing softly in the next room, and the smell of homemade mac and cheese still hanging in the air, I felt something I hadn't felt since the night at the truck stop on exit 42. Not happiness, it was too early for that. Something quieter. Something like the first warm day after a long winter, when the air changes and you realize the cold isn't permanent, even though it felt like it would last forever. I didn't have a word for it then. I think now the word might have been hope. It's September now. 5 months since the night I walked into my living room and said 6 words to a man sitting in my chair. I'm writing this at the kitchen table in my apartment. I got a bigger place last month, a 2-bedroom duplex about 2 miles from the old house, close enough that Maisie can ride her bike over when she's a little older. The local runs pay less than the long haul, but I've picked up some weekend work doing deliveries for a building supply company, and between the 2 jobs, I'm making enough to cover rent, child support, and groceries without falling behind. I cook dinner every night now, even when it's just for me. I've gotten decent at it. Nothing fancy, chili, stir-fry, pasta, the kind of meals you learn from YouTube videos at midnight. But there's something about standing at a stove at the end of the day, doing something with your hands that feeds someone, that makes a small apartment feel less like a place you ended up and more like a place you chose. The kids are adjusting. That's the word the therapist uses. Adjusting. And I suppose it's accurate, though it sounds too clean for what it actually looks like. What it looks like is Maisie asking me every other Friday when I pick them up, "Is this a daddy weekend or a mommy weekend?" As though her life is a calendar she has to check before she knows where she belongs. What it looks like is Owen going quiet in the car on Sunday evenings because he's learned that the drive back to Laura's house means I'm leaving again. He doesn't cry anymore. He used to. Now he just gets still, and the stillness is worse. I hold his hand the whole drive and talk about what we'll do next weekend, and by the time we pull into the driveway, he's usually okay. Usually. I hate that word. Usually means sometimes he's not, and those times are the ones I carry with me through the week like stones in my pockets. Laura and I are civil. We exchange the kids on the porch without small talk, the way you'd hand off a package to a courier. She looks tired. Not the kind of tired she was when I was on the road. That was the tired of doing everything alone. This is the tired of having broken something that can't be unbroken, and knowing it every time she looks at her children shuttling between 2 houses that used to be one. We don't talk about Kevin. I heard from someone that she hasn't been seeing anyone. I don't know if that's true, and I don't ask. Our conversations are limited to logistics, pickup times, dentist appointments, Maisie's school supplies, Owen's allergy medication. Efficient, functional, empty. Sometimes, when she hands me Owen's overnight bag and our fingers almost touch, I feel a flash of something. Not love, not anymore, but memory. The ghost of the girl I married in a church basement 11 years ago, both of us too young to know what we were promising, standing there in borrowed shoes and a second-hand suit, believing that wanting to be happy was the same thing as knowing how. I saw Kevin once. It was a Saturday in August. I was at a gas station on the highway, filling up the work truck, and a gray Silverado pulled in on the other side of the pump island. I recognized it before I recognized him, the toolbox behind the cab, the ladder rack, the dent in the rear quarter panel. He got out, and we saw each other at the same time. He froze with his hand on the gas cap. I froze with the nozzle in the tank. We stood there for maybe 5 seconds, separated by 10 feet of concrete and a pump island, and neither of us said a word. He looked smaller than I remembered. Thinner, maybe. Or maybe that's just what people look like when you stop hating them and see them for what they are. Ordinary. He filled his tank, got back in his truck, and drove away. I finished filling mine and did the same. That was it. No confrontation, no closure, no dramatic final exchange. Just 2 men at a gas station on a Saturday, each heading somewhere the other wasn't, and the only thing between them a silence that said everything there was to say. Tommy retired from driving last month. His back finally gave out, same as my father's, same as it gets all of us eventually. He took a job managing the parts counter at an auto supply store. Less money, no road, home every night. We meet for coffee on Wednesday mornings before my shift. He's the only person in my life who knows the full story, every detail, and who has never once judged me for the parts that were my fault. Last week, over coffee, he said something I've been thinking about since. You know the difference between you and me, Cole? We both lost our families on the road. But you figured out the road was the problem. I never did. I just kept driving, and by the time I stopped, there was nothing to come home to. He stirred his coffee and looked out the window at the parking lot. You stopped in time. Your kids know your face. They know your voice. They know you make mac and cheese from scratch. That's not nothing. That's the whole damn thing. I think about that a lot. I think about the road, and the cab, and the broken white line at 2 in the morning. I think about all the miles I drove believing I was providing for my family when I was really just leaving them. I think about Laura, alone in that house week after week, doing everything I should have helped with, slowly running out of reasons to wait for a man who was always somewhere else. I think about Kevin wiping cheese off my son's chin, and how that image used to make me want to destroy something, and how now it just makes me sad. Not for me, but for Owen, who deserved to have his own father do that and didn't, because his father was in a truck in Ohio. And I think about that night on the highway, the one I started this story with, rolling through the dark with a country song on the radio about a man losing his woman. I didn't find it relevant to my life back then. I do now. But here's what those songs never tell you. Losing isn't the end. It's the fork in the road. You can keep driving straight, the way you always have, pretending the miles don't matter. Or you can turn, even though you don't know where the new road goes, even though it's darker and narrower and the pay is worse. I turned. I'm still on that road. I don't know where it ends, but for the first time in years, I'm not driving away from something. I'm driving toward it. And every night, when I hang up the phone after saying goodnight to my kids, I sit in the quiet of this small apartment and know one thing for certain. Tomorrow, when something breaks, I'll be the one who fixes it.